Our next guest is Vincent Scardado. Did I say it right?
That is correct.
Okay, now you're a historian?
A historian who enjoys history, yes.
Enjoys history.
I enjoy history.
Where did this all begin?
Oh, it's a lifetime.
What grade did they have in grade school? High school? Where?
Well, I actually, at one point in my life, I was a history teacher.
Aha! Okay. We caught you.
You did.
All right.
But, eventually I went into sales, which is what I do now. But I just caught the bug of history. And I think that history is a very fantastic thing to enjoy.
It's amazing. Isn't it amazing?
It is. And there's so much history in so many different places and so many different angles, and not just the history of war and dates and this kind of. It's just the history of a particular place, the relationships, the economy. If you really look at everything in the historical elements of all these things, it becomes alive, and you could try to dig deep and become part of that. And that's what I enjoy.
Now, what is your favorite thing in history? If you'd just like to talk on any particular subject, what would be the most thing you enjoy the most in history?
Well, living in New York, it's a lovely place to live in if you like history, because there's so much history around here in the city. Yet there a lot of people who live in New York, they have a tendency to kind of be stuck, is what I'll say it, in New York, and sometimes they don't venture out. It's amazing.
You mean because you stay in your little neighborhoods and you don't go wandering to the west side or down to the end of the island and stuff like that?
There's so much that New York has to offer, and of course you could spend 10 lifetimes in New York and not get done with what you need to want to see and get done. But there's so much out there too, and I'm amazed sometimes at the people that I meet. Sometimes, like a place like Niagara Falls. Somebody in New York, you ask them, well, have you ever been in Niagara Falls? No, I haven't ever been there. I can go up to Buffalo area and say, have you ever been in New York City? No, I really have never been there. I'm like, why? That's crazy, right? So I get to travel around a lot as a salesperson on the road. And I get
New
to see...
York State or where?
New York State, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Jersey.
So you got the Northeast.
The Northeast corridor. And I get to go to a lot of different places. And you start to see the relationship between New York City and other places that exist.
Those other places.
Those other places. And they're very interesting. For instance, when you look at New York 150 years ago, it was a tremendously different place. Even from an economical perspective.
What did it look like?
Well, first of all, the whole, when you look at the Brooklyn Bridge, and you look at Trinity Church, those were the big features of New York at that time.
Trinity Church was the skyscraper?
It was big. If you see maps from that time, it's pretty amazing.
This is Trinity Church down in
Trinity Church down by Wall Street. Exactly. And the Brooklyn Bridge, if you see old photographs of New York, was just humongous compared to the rest. And one of the other features that I like in those old pictures is when you look at the shoreline of those old pictures, you'll see lots of boats and ships all the way around, which of course today we don't have. And if you look at the economy of that time, everything was driven by, in terms of like the heating of the furnaces. I mean, in today's world, we have refrigerators and electricity, and you want some water, and you go to the hot water and we're so spoiled. Back in those days, people used wood to get heat and stuff like that, but there was sort of a very big need for coal, and that's one of the things I.
So you brought your samples.
I brought my samples with me because this is a great story. One of the places I happened upon in my travels was a town in Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, called Honesdale.
Spelled
Honesdale, Honesdale.
It was a coal mining town?
It's not necessarily a coal mining town, but the coal actually was in the mountain beyond what's called Moosic Mountain. It was about 16 miles away.
What's the name of that mountain again?
Moosic.
Moosic.
Yes.
All right.
And the coal was there. The difference between that coal is called anthracite coal.
Right.
It was sort of a rock hard coal, as opposed to bituminous coal. Now, I don't want to get into this too deeply, other than to say that anthracite coal burned really, really hot. And
It takes a long time.
It takes a longer time, but it was, if you could get it to burn the right way, it would be a huge development for the economy of New York. Okay, so the D&H Canal Company was born, and the D&H, that's the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company.
Okay.
And if you once again go back in time and you go to that era in time, you'll understand then that the canals were very, very important. That was the big way. You know, there were
That was like the railroads.
well, it was even before the railroad.
No, I mean saying, but that's the method of transportation before railroad.
Exactly.
Right.
In fact, you mentioned the railroads. Honesdale, PA, is the birthplace of the American Railroad. The very, very first steam locomotive was brought to Honesdale to bring the coal cars up over the Moosic Mountains to get the anthracite coal. And so that's when you talk about why this coal was so important. If you think about the economy of New York, all the houses, all the furnaces, all the restaurants, even the boats and ships needed this coal. And
so they dug it out of northeastern part of Pennsylvania, brought it down the Delaware River?
well, before they even got to the Delaware River, which they did, the engineer for the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, his name was Jervis, he had this wonderful idea that he would build a gravity railroad. And the reason why was because the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company got their tremendous locomotive, the very first in America, and it failed. It was 7 tons, and the tracks were built for 6.5 tons. It made one run and split the tracks, and that was it.
The end of it. Okay.
So they had to come up with something else. And what they came up with was a system of a bunch of independent steam houses that had pulleys that brought these cars up. They loaded them up, and then the cars would just come down with gravity to Honesdale. And then the coal was offloaded into boats, and yes, it would go down the Lackawaxen River, the Delaware.
The what river now, you call that? Huh?
Lackawaxen River.
Lackawaxen River?
Yes, the Lackawaxen
River, okay.
Say that 10 times fast.
Yeah, right.
And then
That's the Lackawanna Railroad then, isn't it?
Well, yeah, the Lackawanna Railroad is not far away.
Yeah,
That's
okay,
correct.
so it came... So it came down, all right, so we got down onto the river, blah. Okay, we put it on the boats. Now, where did the boats go?
The boats were towed down the canal.
Yeah.
And of course, the canal, all the canals
Now,
had
wait a
been
minute,
towed
down the Delaware.
Well, it would eventually get to the Delaware.
Oh, was the canal over there?
Yeah, well, the canal, when you talk about a canal, whether it's Erie Canal or whatever canal, part of it, they tried to feed into the existing rivers. But of course, the rivers didn't always go where they wanted them to go,
right.
so they'd have to build the canal, and they would have to build locks so that the water would rise up high enough.
Oh, they had to do that too?
Oh, yeah. There was
really?
108 locks on the D&H Canal.
How long was the canal?
Oh, it went from Honesdale, and it came down to the Delaware, it came up to Kingston, New York, and then it flowed down the Hudson to New York.
Oh, it went up
Actually, to Weehawken, New Jersey.
It went up through Weehawken, up through...
Kingston, New York. Well, it feeds...
I never knew that.
Yeah, it feeds... the Delaware feeds through a bunch of different rivers.
Yeah, I understand, but
it kind
eventually
of
gets
catches
there.
them all.
So you took the coal from northeastern Pennsylvania, take it up to the Kingston, and then bring it down the river.
Bring down the river
To
Weehawken, and then it was delivered to...
No, wait a minute. Why did Weehawken get in here?
Well, because New York, at the time, we think of New York as being congested now. Even at that time, was very congested.
Yes, right.
So, there's all this coal. You had no place to put it in New York, so they brought it over to New Jersey.
Oh,
There's lots of land. They stored it there, and,
And then as needed, they brought it across. Ah.
Now, the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, D&H, was the first $1 million enterprise in the United States of America. The first $1 million.
And that year was?
1827 was when it actually
1827.
went into business.
And when did they go out of business?
1898, believe it or not.
1898. They were still hauling it until then.
Well, actually what they wanted to use and what failed in the beginning is exactly what destroyed them in the end, and that was the railroad.
Really?
It didn't destroy them. It destroyed the gravity train, bring the coal into the boats down the ring.
Boy, that must have been awful labor intensive.
It really was. It really was.
How much did you pay for a ton of coal in those days?
Oh, geez, I don't know.
10 cents, 20 cents?
I don't know. That's a good question. Now,
See,
I
yeah,
gotta.
yeah,
Let me write that down on my list of things
okay.
to do.
So anyways, they brought the coal down to New York. They started in Weehawken. Were the path tubes have anything to do with hauling coal into Manhattan?
The path tubes?
Yeah.
No, they were.
They were
built,
strictly
yeah.
way along.
Yeah.
I just wondered, just because they're saying they're kind of old and they're very vulnerable or something. They were saying the other day in the news.
Yeah, no, it's that's a whole different ball of wax as far as that.
So who made all the money on this deal?
Well, one of the guys who made a lot of money was Philip Hone, who was the mayor of New York at the time.
And what did Philip Hone do besides deliver coal?
Well, he and there was the main thrust of the D&H in the beginning was a couple of Swiss guys, two brothers named Wirtz. In the War of 1812, they furnished the American Army with uniforms. They were out of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, they made a lot of money. Not only were they paid a lot of money, but they were granted this big tract of land in northeast Pennsylvania, which didn't seem like it was worth anything. They just kind of threw it in because, they had nothing. The United States said, take this, go ahead, have fun.
Or something,
But these guys were real smart, and they found these anthracite coal beds there, and they said, hey, New York is starving for coal, and they just definitely made the best thing out of it. So
amazing.
Now Philip Hone, if I have a
well, let me take a little break here because we're doing our segment here. Vince and I will be back and we'll talk about Mr. Philip Hone.
Philip Hone.
H-O-N-E.
H-O-N-E.
Mayor of New York.
Mayor of New York.
All right, let's find out about him right after this. Welcome back, and we're going to find out about Mayor Hone, H-O-N-E, from Mr. Vincent Scardato, historian.
Sir. Well, Mayor Hone, you've heard Hone before in this conversation tonight, and that is where Honesdale was named after, was the mayor of New York. So there's that connection between New York and Pennsylvania.
Was he a good mayor?
I don't know as much about his tenure as mayor in New York, per se. I know more about his connection to the New York coal mining thing. But he seemed to be a pretty good mayor from what I've read about him. And I recently acquired his diary, which I'm in the process of reading.
Diary?
His diary. And that's the thing, when you enjoy history, you try to dig deeper. And one of the ways you dig deeper is to get information. And so this is not an easy book to find.
Was this an in thing that a lot of people kept diaries of?
Yes, people in those days kept diaries as a general rule. This particular one, I mean, if you look at this is his diary. It's the actual physical diary.
For how many years?
Oh, his whole life.
So day one, he
his tenure as mayor, and of course he left the life of politics and he went on to do a lot of things. And little by little, I'm getting through this book. And there's one passage in here. It's a short little passage from Tuesday, December 2nd, 1845.
1845. Well, that's before the Civil War.
Before the Civil War, and in the Delaware and Hudson heyday. And it gives you a little bit of an idea of what will happen when things don't go right in the wintertime. So if you will allow me to read
yes,
from
sir.
here.
Okay, go.
December 2nd, the Western Canal closed at Albany on Saturday, since which time the weather has been severe and the canal navigation is at an end for the year. This comes too suddenly for farmers and merchants engaged in forwarding of produce, of which the West is now making a glorious harvest. The high prices of every article that finds a market in New York, either for home or foreign consumption, have sent them all driving to the utmost to get everything down. Albany is inundated with flour, wheat, corn, etc., all of which, it is hoped, will be gotten down to New York, but much will have been caught at different ports on the canal.
Because the Hudson River froze?
It's too cold, yes. The Hudson parts of the canal were closing down and they became total ice. Exactly. And then the last paragraph is...
Didn't you ever hear of sleighs?
Well...
I don't know.
It's a good point, maybe you ought to... I'm thinking about that. They could have had, a couple of sleds and then say, well,
a couple
all
of
right.
Eskimo dogs, the way you go.
Why not?
Huskies, I mean, yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
So
in other words, if that river froze, then the city of New York would not get food? They must have brought it by cart then, didn't they?
The city of New York would get food. But interestingly, you bring that up. That's one of the big reasons why the Brooklyn Bridge was built. Because the harbor froze. And, once that happened, people couldn't really cross because it was basically ferries going back and forth.
You mean the East River froze?
It froze. And that is why
Now, I've been in New York for, what, 50 years, and I haven't seen it frozen once.
I haven't either, but it did. And, you know, maybe one particular winter was super duper cold, and it froze enough for the ferries not to be able to cross.
That's salt water.
What's that?
That's salt water in the East River.
It freezes on the top, though.
Yeah, I would
So,
imagine.
Basically, that's one of the reasons why the Brooklyn Bridge was built in the first place, because they needed to open that up.
To get people, to
get
get
people.
produce
Nothing
from
could
Manhattan
stop
into
it.
Brooklyn, or Brooklyn to Manhattan.
It opened up the boroughs, and New York really needed to kind of
Get space.
get space, yeah. Lower East Side.
Were you born and raised in the
Oh,
city?
yeah. Yeah, I
Really?
was born here.
Whereabouts?
I was born in Ridgewood, Queens.
Ridgewood. What's
and-
the history of Ridgewood?
Well, I can tell you the history of my grandfather was a coal and ice man, so that's why I'm intrigued by coal.
Oh, so he brought the cold on the ice.
Well, he had an ice business and an oil
Now,
business.
where did he get his ice from? The East River?
Well, ice. You know what? The ice came from a lot of places, including places like Pennsylvania. There's a lot of lakes out there. They'd carve the ice up. Keene Lake is
Now,
one
how
of
do
the
they get the
places.
ice here if the canals were frozen? Ha ha ha! You thought you were a good historian.
I'll
huh?
tell you, you're tough.
You slid that ice all the way down to New York, didn't you?
You're tough. Well, ice comes in all.
No, I
different
was
places.
up. I was up in St. John's, and they had a big lake up there. And what they did, they cut the ice and they slid it down the hill right to the boats.
And
they
then the
brought it
boats
into-
bring 'em down.
Brought in New York.
It had to come
Imagine.
from some. Yeah, it's amazing. Big business at that time.
But how do they cut this ice and how do they haul it? They really must
It's
have-
all done back in the day with just hard work.
work.
You know, there's pictures of people chopping the coal up with shovels, and you know, imagine doing that every day,
Without
8 to 10
machinery.
hours a day.
Now, your father, he delivered ice to the
My
homes?
grandfather.
Did you remember seeing him do that?
I never saw him do that. I mean,
I remember when I was small, when we were at our summer cottage, we had to have ice. And they would bring it in a, not in a thing, in a like a, blanket like, and then they threw it in the refrigerator, and then they would put a sign in the window. They want 25 pounds or 50 pounds.
exactly.
Really.
It was all big business back in the day. You know.
And then the water had to drip out someplace, and it had to go out through the drain system somehow or out to the backyard.
There were no refrigerators. All the food was kept, you know, from spoiling. From
And ice cream in those days was a treat because you had to keep it in with the ice.
That's right.
Yeah, and you only can make it as long as you had ice.
Exactly.
Wow.
It's the only way to do it. So.
So now, when you were born in Ridgewood,
Yeah.
and you became a history teacher, where?
I became a history teacher in South Ozone Park for
Uh-huh.
3 years.
3 years.
And then it was not as much money as I needed to raise a family.
Right, so you went
So
out and did that.
I kind of said, well, I have to do something else.
Move
And,
on.
and I got myself.
Did
into
you
some-
find it enjoyable being a history teacher?
Oh, I loved being a history teacher. I loved
What
every
grade?
minute.
What grade?
Eighth
level?
grade,
Eighth
American
graders?
history, earth science, all that kind of stuff. And I love the history of science. I mean, there's
Yeah.
so much to that too.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
wonderful.
Do the kids absorb history better now than they do today?
Um,
Do they appreciate history?
You
Did
know
they
what?
appreciate it at that time?
I'm a great believer in the fact that things don't really change all that much. You hear about people saying, "Oh, back in the good old days." I don't know.
I don't quite say they were good old days.
You
I
know,
mean, but in the old days, yes.
I think kids are real smart today. And I think kids were pretty smart when I was growing up.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're as smart as you want to be,
Yeah.
and the schools are what you make out of it.
Oh.
So, pretty much, that's what I think. I don't think there's a tremendous difference there.
Yeah.
So,
So now, if you wrote your history book, what would you write about?
oh my gosh. Basically, the history of me in the last 20 years of being in business for myself is basically in sales.
Or you're self-employed.
I'm self-employed, yeah.
What do you sell?
I sell lasers.
Lasers.
Yes, sir.
Now, anybody told you in 1823 that somebody will walk around with a machine that emits light, that cuts this and does all these applications, oh, you're out of your brain.
It's amazing what they do.
Yeah.
It's just a myriad.
So your applications for your lasers are?
Fabricating acrylic, signs.
Fabricating acrylic.
Cutting acrylic. you
Oh,
know.
cutting the cloth.
There's a lot of point of purchase display work that needs to be cut and
Okay.
together. Architectural modeling is a huge.
Architecture model. How do
Yeah,
you use a laser?
well,
do that?
you know,
I mean, cutting the cardboard or making the model or what?
Yeah, making the model.
Oh, I never thought of that. Okay.
Yeah, well, you know,
the old-fashioned scissors is out of business.
You know why? It wasn't long ago that they were still cutting that stuff out with razor blades and stuff like that. Now you take the AutoCAD file, you bring it into the laser, press the button, and it cuts.
Zip, 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 zip.
That's it. It's quite amazing.
I was at a fair where they were cutting names out of plywood.
Yes, absolutely.
What do you call that process?
There's a lot of ways to do that. Generally, though, they may do that with a scroll saw, and you'll see hand-on type thing, or they may have a router with a V-bit, or they may have a laser. There's a different ways of doing that. They may cut it out in one process and then mark it with a laser and still.
What was the most unusual laser you sold?
Oh my gosh. That's when a French gentleman came down with a French accent. He took out a piece of skin out of a vial and put it on the laser. He drew this three-dimensional thingy on there, and he said, I want to cut that, and of course I vectorized it, and we cut it out, and we gave it to him, and he walked out, and he says, I'll send you the money tomorrow. He took about like $30,000. And I was like, wow, it took like 5 minutes. Well, as it turns out, he took that tissue, and when he's a big open heart surgeon, and when he put that tissue over the heart when it had damage, he cauterized that and repaired heart wall damage. That's the weirdest one I've ever come
So
across.
you for surgery then, actually?
For surgery, yeah.
All right, Vince, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Wow, you got to read your history books and come back, and we'll have another test.
Okay.
Now remember, the rivers froze. How do they get the ice to New
That's
York?
right. I'm going to have to find that one out.
Okay, thank you again.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll be back.